with Julia Cowley of The Consult, her own podcast, and former FBI agent, former supervisor, former FBI profiler. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to see you, although I just saw you the other day.
That's right.
We've known each other for a
Ju-
while.
that's right. That's right. So, Julia, as I laid out in the first part of the podcast, this motion that alleges a conflict of interest, it kind of focuses on two factual issues, and so I wanted to talk to you about how you would deal with that investigatively. Um, and those two issues, just to recap, is when did this relationship begin? And then, second, did Fani Willis benefit? And again, this sort of goes to, did she get money, or did she get trips, or did she get something like that from the special prosecutor, Nathan Wade? So, Julia, just maybe before we start, try to frame this a little bit for us. This is an investigation, but how does it differ from some of the investigations that you did into things like cash and facts like that?
Well, I think what I'm noticing about this, and first of all, I just want to make sure everyone knows I'm not an attorney, and I'm just observing this as a former FBI agent and I investigated white collar as well and public corruption, but it seems the tables have turned a little bit because the side that's normally on the prosecution side is on the defensive right now, and then you have the defendants who are more on the I guess the prosecution side, and they are the ones at this point trying to prove certain aspects as opposed to the prosecution side. There's trying to defend that. And so they are conducting an investigation. And I think what's a little bit different, as I see it, is that they don't have the resources necessarily that they would have if they were on the law enforcement side. That's what it seems to me. So they're limited in what they could find. So, on the law enforcement side, we'd have a lot of resources available to us to get, a lot of information. And I feel like some of the information that they've uncovered, it seems important, it seems relevant to the case, but is it enough? I don't know. I think there would be more that I would be looking for, but I think their hands are tied. I'm not sure they have that ability in their position as the actual defendants, but they're also on the offensive at this point. So if I hopefully that makes sense, but
Yeah,
that's how
no,
I'm viewing it. It's sort of backwards from what you and I would normally see in a case, and how we would approach it. They can't necessarily approach it the same way that we would be able to.
yeah, just to put put a sharper point on that, if I was the assistant U.S. attorney and you were the FBI agent, we'd be able to conduct an investigation times covertly. So the people that we're investigating don't even know that we're investigating them, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a process to compel testimony of witnesses through the grand jury. And again, that's not necessarily known to the person being investigated. We can obtain search warrants. We can literally go into somebody's phone or house to obtain records. And in fact, we can get some very specific location data relating to cell phones from the cell phone companies. So I think your point is exactly right. This is in a different procedural posture, and their tools are not the same tools that we would have had if we were investigating, say, a illegal business that was using cash.
Correct. Yeah, and you're right. Not having the ability to get a search warrant to be able to get the context and the content of text messages, and like you said, putting people in front of a grand jury, compelling testimony from potential witnesses. I mean, obviously they are putting witnesses forward, but it's a little bit different, and I think they're limited with who they can call and who they're going to call. So I think it's challenging. But all those things that you've pointed out in terms of trying to establish how far a particular relationship goes back, we would really be unlimited in what we could do. I mean, obviously, we would have to follow all legal procedures with subpoenas and search warrants, and we'd have to have probable cause for all of that. And it can't just be a fishing expedition. It has to go to the elements of the crime that we're trying to prove. And I certainly think if they had access to text messages, that might answer a lot of questions. I think some of the evidence that they've already uncovered suggests that, perhaps a time frame of when the relationship at least was ongoing at one particular time. And it really is circumstantial evidence, but that can be very powerful evidence as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. If you think about a relationship, a romantic relationship, and I think that's the term they've been using in these hearings. I think in the filings, they also refer to a personal relationship. So these terms are a little squishy, but the the parties are, in terms of going back, like, let's think of the evidence that they do have, right? So Trump's lawyer got a subpoena, sent it to AT&T, and the private investigator did some analysis of the records that they got back. And one thing that was pretty clear, they don't have the content of the text message, but there are a great number of text messages. I think it was like thousands, and then thousands of calls between the two of them over, I don't know, I think a year or two. I don't know. What does that say to you?
Well, I mean, that's a lot. I mean, what I would want to see is, was the case ongoing? I think this was before the case was started. So I'd want to see if that's the same number, if there's a pattern. I mean, it seems like a lot of calls. I mean, I certainly know when I was active in certain investigations and I had a co-case agent or a prosecutor that I was working with, or other investigators from other agencies, our text messages and our phone calls, or not necessarily text messages. We always tried to avoid that, but just so we don't have, that's just more to produce, right? So, we would have a significant increase in the amount of calls, especially like if we were on surveillance or it was a busy time or we were preparing for trial. So I'd want to look at kind of what's going on, but it seems like an excessive amount, but it could be explained by work that they were doing at the time. It could be they talk a lot, and so, but it does establish, which I think is, common knowledge, and I think they've admitted it, they have been friends for a long time. They've known each other, and so, friends talk too. So.
Sure. And I guess part of it too would be, because I remember back in the day when I was doing domestic violence cases and sexual assault cases, and the relationship between the parties was very important. And a lot of times we wouldn't have the content of calls or the content of text messages, but you could learn a lot from what they call metadata. So metadata is data about information about data, data about data. And so, like, part of that would be the time of the calls. So probably when you were talking on the phone with your co-case agents, there was probably a time limit to that, right? You would expect.
Correct. It would be mostly within normal business hours, and that unless on a specific day we had an operation, we had to get up really early or something. I mean, it would be the context, but generally I would not be talking to my coworkers at 2 or 3 a.m.
Yeah, and I think this is one of these things that I think the ordinary person, you apply common sense and you think of your own life. How many people in my life do I call or text that much, right? I think that's a pretty good guidepost to evaluating this information. Now, some of the other information that Trump's lawyer got from the phone company is cell tower location. And there are limitations to that.
There are.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm not a cell phone expert. I've used the cell phone data in my own cases, and I've had experts help me interpret it. But when we're using our phones and other devices that that can be tracked, they ping off cell phone towers. And I think generally it's thought, you're going to ping off the tower that's closest to you, and that will indicate kind of an area of your location. That's not always the case. I've learned that there could be, based on the terrain, based on building. I mean, you may not be able to be as accurate, and you may not even be pinging off your closest cell phone tower. But I found it to be fairly reliable information. I can't recall ever having a case where cell phone data indicated that someone was in an area at some point in time, and we learned later that was completely wrong. The data was wrong. That's never happened, and I'm not aware. I can't recall a case that at least I was part of where maybe a defendant disputed it. So, in my experience, it's been fairly accurate, but it's not going to tell you exactly where somebody is. I'm not going to just say, okay, they're right there on that little corner right there, right next to that mailbox. And I think in some areas where maybe you do have more cell phone towers, it can be more accurate. So that's the extent of my expertise in cell phone data. And we're fortunate at the FBI. And again, looking at the defendants in this case that are conducting their investigation and trying to prove what, that there's a conflict of interest. We have this kind of unlimited access to these experts, not only the cell phone experts, but forensic accountants. And, we just have these people that we can go to, and people who have these areas of expertise that can not only help us obtain the correct information, because you need to know what to ask for as well. It's not like, what am I asking for? What data? What?
and you have to ask for it the right way too.
Exactly, because you'll get something back and you're like, I don't know what this is. I didn't ask. And they're like, well, you didn't ask for it the right way, especially when it comes to like computer related stuff. That was also not my area of expertise. I sound like I had no area of expertise, but exactly. So we would have people we could ask, like, what am I specifically asking for? And they would help interpret it. And certainly there are sometimes if you get bank records back or cell phone records back, and they're pretty simple. I'm not, and I can interpret them, and I can, provide a summary to a prosecutor such as yourself about, okay, here's what we've obtained, and here's what we have, and here's what I think it shows. But in the really big, complex cases where maybe you have multiple individuals or companies involved, then we have a team of people that can work on that.
Sure.
And in some cases, and I'm sure you're aware of, we've had like multiple forensic accountants on cases, and so that's the benefit of working for an agency like the FBI.
Instead of here where they're relying on a private investigator, right? Who's limited. Yeah. But let's go back to the cell tower information. Now, I've used those when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and oftentimes what you do is you get a map with circles on them, which shows you, okay, this is the area that he could have been in. Right. And then beyond that, there's no way that he could be in that. And what I found was that it was usually very powerful when you had multiple data points, right? One ping isn't going to do much for you. Pinging repeatedly over a period of time, that's much more persuasive, right?
Right.
And then the other thing that I found about this cell tower data is that when you could combine it with another piece of evidence that you had, it became very persuasive. So
like
for example,
GPS.
Like GPS would be great, but even something like, I remember we were looking, I don't know, this came up a few times actually. We were looking for sex offenders who were not registering where they were supposed to be registering. And we're trying to figure out where they were over a period of time. So you get the cell tower information, you'd see these circles. And then you'd say, okay, well, where do they live? Well, it just so happens the place where they keep pinging is near where they live or where they work. So that lends credibility to the cell tower information. It's not just the cell tower that's telling you that they're there, but this other information.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on that score, let me ask you a question about sort of trying to marry up pieces of this cell tower and this metadata. So the investigator said that on a couple of different days, he was able to figure out that the phone of Wade called Fani Willis late at night, and then he starts pinging off of towers near her condo. And then it stopped pinging at 3:30, 4:30 in the morning. So I don't know, how persuasive is that to you of he drove to her house and he stayed there for a few hours?
As an investigator, that's very persuasive to me. So I mean, I know there's kind of this age-old thing where the investigators always think I've made the case, and the prosecutors are always not quite.
Somebody like me, right? Pouring cold water on your
All
investigation.
All the time. I mean, I find that very compelling. You have that other bit of information. Is it direct evidence? It's not. But is it strong circumstantial evidence? I would think so. And if there's let's say they deny I was there, I was somewhere else. Well, then, what evidence do you have to show that they were actually somewhere else in the area and not there? And I think I heard the district attorney or somebody had said that she was not even home and was traveling during this one of the period of times that he was supposedly at her house. So as an investigator, I would want to try to obtain those records. Where was her cell phone during the time? And are there travel records? Are there financial records to show that she was traveling? I mean, that's what I would do. I'm not sure they have the ability to do that in this particular case. It's just not a normal criminal case that I would, be able to really, turn over every stone. But those are the things that we would be looking at. But I do find it to be very good circumstantial evidence that he was over at her place during this period of time. You have not only the call, but you have the movement of the phone from his area to her area. You have it there for a particular period of time, and then you have it leaving back to his area. That is persuasive. Now, is it beyond a reasonable doubt? That's what a judge would have to decide, or a jury would have to decide. I mean, I think if it was a murder case, it might take more. So
yeah,
I think sometimes how persuaded someone would be by the evidence can sometimes be dependent on how severe the crime is and how severe the punishment could be. Somebody might make a determination on a lesser crime that they find that evidence to be persuasive, but if it's a more severe crime, they're not willing to jeopardize someone's life and liberty for their entire rest of their life,
right?
Just based on that evidence. So
yeah, but kind of building on your point about the limitations. One of the things that the affidavit of the private investigator said was that he was able to do the analysis for two-day periods. And again, it was sort of in the nature of what we just discussed, pinging repeatedly off of cell towers near her condo in the early morning hours. But again, I think if we were really trying to nail this down, you wouldn't just do it for two-day periods, right? I mean, yes, it would be a lot of work to do the analysis for more days, but the reality is they're trying to not just show where they were on one day, they're trying to show a relationship, a course of conduct. So it's persuasive, but it doesn't, this isn't a, Perry Mason moment. I don't think, but it's certainly, persuasive. And I also think it sort of fits with common sense, right? Like a boyfriend or girlfriend, like before you go over early, late at night or early morning, you'd call first, right? Like that kind of fits in to what we understand human beings do, and I think that sort of lends some weight to it.
Yeah. And you're right. It's trying to establish a pattern is important. I remember an agent who was a mentor to me once said, 3 is a pattern. You have to have 3 well, for whatever, it's like
Yeah,
two
at
times.
least
I
three.
think,
At least three.
yeah, at
Yeah.
least 3 you get a pattern. But yeah, establishing a pattern, and is really important. And it is tough. You only have the 2 days, but to try to do that for a lengthy period of time to get this pattern to establish, okay, when did the relationship start? When did it end? Exactly. What's true? What's not true? That is a significant amount of time and effort. And it's why federal cases take so long, because we do that. We
That's right.
often do that. We go above and beyond sometimes, and it can take years and years. And again, I'm not sure, I'm sure that this team of attorneys is being paid well, but they do not have the resources of a large federal law enforcement agency
Right.
behind them. So yeah, so the 2 days, it really will just depend on the trier of the case.
Right. And in this case, it's the judge. The judge is deciding.
Mm-hmm.
They're not trying to decide whether they're guilty of crimes. They're trying to see, is there a basis for disqualification? But let's move on to the other part of the investigation that you would do, which is the financial part. And I think, a few heads were turned when there was this talk of large amounts of cash being used to reimburse. And in a day and age where everybody's sort of getting away from cash, you have Venmo, like it's interesting. Like if you need to pay somebody back, it's hard. You hardly ever do it in cash, right? I'm actually one of the holdouts. I don't believe in Venmo, but everybody's doing things like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And certainly for large amounts, right? 1,000, 2,000. And actually, and to that point, why don't we play a clip from Fani Willis's testimony where she talks about using cash, and then we can talk about how you'd investigate it.
County that was paid. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about outside of that. Did you ever pay him anything other than cash?
I've only given him cash a few times in the course of what we're talking about.
So if we would go to dinner,
let her finish her answers.
If we would go to dinner, I wouldn't give him cash because he paid for dinner or I paid for dinner. I've given him cash only a few times in life, probably 4.
Okay.
Probably the most money I've ever handed him is $2,500. The least amount of money I've handed him, probably between $500 and $1,000.
You never wrote him a check?
Ma'am, I don't have checks.
Okay. So you have no proof of any reimbursement for any of these things because it was all cash, right?
The testimony of one witness is enough to prove a fact.
So my question
Are you telling
was,
me
do you
that
have
I'm
any
lying
proof?
to you? Is that what you're intimating right here?
I'm asking if you have any proof that you paid him any of these
The
monies.
proof is what I just told you.
All right. So that was some interesting testimony. I guess I was a little surprised when she said she doesn't have checks. I'm not sure. That's the first person I've heard who has a bank account and no checks. But I don't know. What do you make of that testimony? How plausible is that to you, Julia?
Well, I'm not going to completely discount it, because as a white collar investigator, one of the things that we would do is we would review suspicious activity reports from the banks, which they're required to file, and they would send suspicious activity reports if someone's depositing a large amount of cash, or someone came in and they said, okay, I'm going to have to file a cash transaction report. People will then start to structure money because they don't want the report to go to the government. And so there's a lot of reasons. And what I did learn is that, surprisingly, a lot of people, and particularly I'd say elderly people, do deal with cash. They feel safer. They keep it in their homes. I'm not sure that that's safe, but that's how they feel. That's how they were raised. And so we would sometimes get these suspicious activity reports that were so strange, that the bank would say, oh, somebody came in with this large amount of cash and then it was in a big suitcase and they walked out. They didn't want to deposit it after I said I had to do a cash transaction report. We go talk to them and there'd be a plausible explanation. It wasn't related to criminal activity. And that's what we're looking for. Is there criminal activity going on? And so I don't discount it just automatically. I think for a lot of people, especially maybe the younger folks, find that implausible. But I can't just say it's completely implausible based on my experience for, 20 years of seeing that, over 20 years of seeing the strangest things. And there's always like a plausible explanation. I shouldn't say always, but
sometimes.
Often there is, and you're just like, oh, okay, I guess that makes sense. I that's not how I would do it, but
right.
And certainly if she was reimbursing him in cash, that just makes it much more difficult. When you have a digital transaction, obviously that's very easy. And, oftentimes if you are trying to do something illicit, you do use cash. So, but we can't say that with certainty, but I think some people will automatically think that what's going on? Why are you using cash? What are you trying to hide? What don't you want, as made a record? You don't want a digital record of something. So it certainly does make trying to trace something like that much more difficult.
Yeah. So the thing that makes cash the go-to method for people engaged in illegal activity is that it doesn't leave a record trail, right? Mm-hmm. So if you go in and you receive cash, who's to say that you received it? If you go into a store and you buy something with your cash, what record is that you bought it? So that's helpful. And by the way, I do agree with you on the use of cash. I don't think it's inherently implausible. I mean, some people do like to use cash. I've certainly run into that, in the course of my career at the U.S. Attorney's Office. But let's talk about what sorts of records that would help illuminate this question. Mm-hmm. Because this feels like a little bit easier case, right? If you and I were when we were a prosecutor and agent, if we were investigating an illegal business that was generating cash, you would have cash going in and then you'd try to trace where the cash was going, right? Mm-hmm. Here, the money that's coming in is from a bank, right? They're getting paid by the DA's office. That's going through a bank. And so you would need to find out what's going on with how is it coming out. So
yeah, I'd want to see the patterns of cash withdrawals and deposit. I would want to see all those patterns. And the other thing I would want to know, interviewing other people, other witnesses that she's had either relationships with, or I should say anyone, if just in this situation. Other people she's had relationships with, whether business or personal. Is she known to pay cash? Is this a pattern of behavior? That would be really important to me to establish at least whether I believe that is credible or not. And if there's a pattern of that, I'm like, okay, that's sounding more credible to me. If I've never seen her with cash, she's always paid credit card. It's just very strange. And yeah, but I would definitely want to see, has there been a withdrawal of some of the same amount of cash? What's going into the account? And I mentioned the FBI has forensic accountants. We, do a complete audit and they're very good. They have programs, they have abilities, and they also work with prosecutors to get subpoenas and search warrants for accounts. They can identify more accounts that we may not know exist, and then look at credit card records. Are there cash being taken out on credit cards? What are their credit reports suggest? What's their pattern of spending? All of these things you would want to know to determine, is this a plausible explanation, or is this not really fit with the evidence we're seeing, that we've gathered so far?
Yeah, that's, when I was thinking about it, the one thing that would sort of nail this down to show that she was lying about it is that if you got her bank records and there were no cash withdrawals, right?
Right.
I mean, that I think that would be the case where you'd say, okay, this didn't happen, right?
Right.
Now, if you did see some cash withdrawals, then that doesn't necessarily prove that she was paying him back in that way, but at least it makes it possible. Right. And I think what they're hamstrung by is that Fani Willis is trying to fight them on getting the records. So they can't do the job that you talked about, like the forensic accountant. I mean, a forensic accountant can't do much without the records, right?
Right.
So again, like it's almost like what is it? X-Files. The truth is out there, but we don't know it. Based on some of the limitations that they have in trying to show this. But what about the other end of it? What about Wade? What would you be looking for in his records? What would tend to bolster or undermine this
again
story?
Deposits? Looking at his bank deposits and seeing if he's taking that money. I mean, in her testimony, she said, I think the most I gave was $2,500. I mean, that's a lot of cash to carry around, but it's not. Again, it's not like, oh, no way. He could just decide, I'm not going to deposit. I'm not going to go to the trouble, and I'm just going to pay cash with everything that I do for the next, a few months or whatever. That's possible, but I would definitely want to see his deposits. I'd also, again, if I was able to go out and interview witnesses, was he walking around with a lot of cash recently? And was he paying cash? And does he store cash anywhere? I mean, those are the questions I would start to ask, because it may not be a pattern for him to always have a lot of cash on him. And all of a sudden he has a lot of cash. That would bolster her testimony that she paid him back with cash.
Yeah, I think his records would actually be a little less helpful in that if you saw if you saw some deposits, you might think, okay, that would tend to support it. But if you didn't see the deposits, he could have done what you were talking about. Well, instead of using my credit card when I'm at the grocery store, I just pull out cash and I pay for something.
Mm-hmm.
That wouldn't be a crazy thing to do if you had $2,500 in cash, right?
Yeah.
To pay for everyday expenses, in which case you would never see that hit his bank account.
Right. And, another thing you could look at too, if he said, well, I just, I spent it all. Like, let's say you go and ask, okay, where is the cash she gave you? Well, I spent it. Where'd you spend it? And just sort of nail down where he might have spent. And then, go back and look at his history of spending. Is he
right?
Is it, continuing to, use his credit card at Starbucks at the same amount, or is he, does that match up with what he told us of how he was spending his money? And if you don't really see a change in spending habits, then that could be potential information. It's not the smoking gun by any means, but it could, again, it can help paint the picture of what really happened.
Yeah. So, well, let's try to get to let's wrap up here. And I'll just pose to you the question that Judge McAfee is going to have to decide. Now, it has differing witness testimony, right? There's the ex-friend who says that, yes, they were in a relationship. You have the two of them saying that they weren't in a relationship. You have this cell tower information, which lends some weight to the ex-friend, right? How do you think the judge will come down on it? And I don't think it's going to be a beyond a reasonable doubt standard. I don't think it's that high. I think he's going to be deciding things to a preponderance. I don't know. Well, let me just ask you, as an investigator, how do you come out on this? I mean, would you think that they were in a romantic relationship or not sure?
Yes, I do think so. And I know that because they've admitted to it. I guess the question is, was it before he was hired?
Right. The timing of it. Yeah, that's
the timing.
That's really the question.
Correct. And I think that was the point. Is it before he was hired or after? And the defense has the defendant's attorneys and investigators have put forth some evidence that I think is persuading to me that they might have had a relationship prior to his being hired. Now, is it to the point where I could find that to be a fact? I really don't know. I think just my common sense, I'd probably say, yeah, I think they were probably in a relationship longer than or prior to him being hired. So that would be what I would say as maybe a person sitting in the courtroom observing that
Right.
they had a relationship longer than what they say.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of looks that way. And the thing that I'm thinking about is what's their escape valve? Like, they're thinking of, I always think of, what is your, what's your story? What's your cover story? Right. And, or maybe it's legitimate, but what if it comes down to their subjective definition of what a relationship is? We talked at the beginning of this romantic relationship. We talk about personal relationship. I remember one time when I was a prosecutor. This goes back quite a few years. I was actually examining a witness and laying like a background question. So I said, Miss So and So, I understand you were in a relationship with Mr. So and So from this point to this point. I thought this was sort of, kind of uncontroversial. A romantic relationship was a defined term, and we just wanted to make sure that that's what we were talking about. And she she clapped back at me and said, what are you talking about? There was no romance. This wasn't a romantic relationship. We had sex, but there's no romance. So the point is that sometimes these terms mean different things to different people. And, maybe, the course of this relationship subjectively meant something to them at the time that, I don't know, reasonable people would disagree with. Or maybe this is the cover story. I don't know. What do you think about that theory?
Well, I think that's a good point, because we don't know how they're determining relationship. I think you kind of have to be pretty specific about it. But I think that you reminded me, on my own podcast, we covered the murder of Lisa Ziegert and the arrest of her murderer, Gary Shera. And at the time Gary was arrested, he had a girlfriend, and they had been together for a while. And they didn't live together, but he would stay over with her, and they went out to dinner and movies and all of that, but they did not have a sexual relationship. So, they were considered a couple, and they felt they were both in a romantic relationship, but there was no sexual relationship. He didn't want one. So is that, I guess everybody has a different take on what that means in a relationship. So, I mean, in a way, everybody's in a relationship with somebody in some form.
Right. Yeah.
Whether it's a friendship, whether it's a emotional relationship, whether, there's just different definitions. So they might need to clarify what they mean. And is that defined under the law some way in Georgia? Like, what constitutes a relationship?
Or a romantic relationship.
A romantic relationship. What does that mean? Are there legal standards? I don't know. I think many of us sort of intuitively understand what that should mean. But legally, you have to be able to define it.
Yeah. One thing that strikes me too about this particular situation, I mean, he was married at the time, and he's seeing her. I'm not, like, in our culture, I'm not even sure what you call that, right? Like, are they boyfriend, girlfriend, mistress, paramour? I mean, like, the fact that you have trouble even coming up with a word for it kind of shows you that this, I'll use the word association, it kind of has some fuzzy edges to it.
Yeah, I was going to say it's blurred.
Yeah,
It's
blurred
blurred
right.
a little bit.
Yeah.
Right. I like the term paramour, but paramour doesn't necessarily mean, one person's married or not. So I don't know if that mistress or I don't know what the exact term boyfriend, girlfriend. I mean, I guess you could say she was his girlfriend, but they might not define it that way.
That's right.
So they,
So that might give them the leeway to say, look, because here's the thing, as I said in the first part of the podcast, the repercussions to the two of them, if they're found to have given false testimony about this, and unfortunately, this is just the type of topic that witnesses lie about, right? And the repercussions could be severe to them. But I could see the judge kind of giving them an out. And it's like, look, what I think what was going on was a romantic relationship as the law sees it or as I see it, but maybe you didn't see it that way. And so therefore you didn't intentionally perjure yourselves. And that sort of gives everybody a way to walk away from this case or walk away from the decision without major ramifications.
Yeah, I have no idea how he'll decide, and you have that second part of it as well. Was there a benefit, and
Right.
or and I think that's going to be the more complicated decision, the second half of the part of the case. I think it's a little more complicated, and certainly I'm not familiar with the laws in Georgia, but I'm sure they're very specific, and he's going to go exactly, okay, here's what the law says, and this either meets it or doesn't meet it. So, in any case, in terms of public officials, we're always just looking for that quid pro quo. Is someone getting a personal benefit, by misusing their position?
Now, let me ask you a question.
That's kind of the bottom line.
Let me ask you a question, because it kind of feels like Fani Willis and Nathan Wade are kind of okay with leaving the record murky on both of these questions of when the relationship started or whether they got the money. So you heard Ashley Merchant act, well, do you have proof? Right? Do you have proof to show that you did it? Well, no, I don't. And I must say, as somebody who was a prosecutor, and I'll just ask this of you as a federal agent, I mean, if my integrity were questioned, it would not be good enough that you couldn't prove it, right? I would want to prove the opposite. I would want to make it clear beyond any kind of doubt that I had acted properly and that there's no there at all. And yet they seem to be okay, because they don't want the records to come out, of just sort of leaving it a little murky. I don't know. What do you think? Like, I mean, just as an agent, like, how would you feel like if your integrity were impugned in this way?
I'd feel the exact same way. I would not. I mean, that's one of the tenets of being an FBI agent, is being honest and integrity. Obviously it's part of our motto, integrity, and my integrity is very important. And I would be the same way. I'd want to give all the proof that I was telling the truth. I wasn't lying. I would give access to whatever was needed to prove that I wasn't lying, because that's the most important thing. And as an FBI agent, and I have unfortunately seen this, not a lot in my career, but once you've lost your integrity, you're just not capable of doing your job anymore. You can't testify. You have this problem of following you around the rest of your career. You have to disclose that somehow you lied somewhere, or were found to have perjured yourself or something. You can lose your job
Right.
as well. So integrity is extremely important. It's really, and it's, I just can't imagine sitting there,
really.
having someone, attacking my integrity and knowing I have the truth behind me. But when you have the truth behind you, it's just,
you just lay your cards on the table.
Right. And, one thing I will say is that sometimes people do lie, and that maybe they're not lying about something. There's something else, that there's like this impression management where they don't want you to know about something else, or so they may tell a lie, and then you think, oh, okay, they they have something really bad to hide, and it turns out it what really wasn't that bad. So I have seen that as well. I mean, it's possible, they don't want something else to come out. I don't know. But you're right. I think it does seem like they just, they're going to leave it as it is, and hope that the judge rules in their favor.
Yeah. I hope that the grounds for disqualification have not been met. And of course, the danger in all of that is, well, what if somehow they come up with more proof later on? I mean, the case would still be going on. They could bring that would, again, if you knew that information was out there that could, hurt you. I mean, it's almost like the sort of Damocles over your head, right? But on the other hand, if you knew that you were correct, I mean, probably I'd be like logging on to my online bank account, printing out the records, running into court and say, hey, here, I'm showing you, look, I withdrew all this cash. This lends credibility to my story, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think that's going to happen.
I think you're right about that.
I don't see.
They're not really
happening.
doing that. Yeah.
No, they're on the defensive right now. And so, I mean, of course they are. They've had accusations made against them. They have to defend themselves. And, I will just have to see what the judge decides.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave it there. But before we go, tell us a little bit more about your podcast and what you're up to these days.
So my podcast is called The Consult: Real FBI Profilers, and I'm the host, but I also have 3 other retired FBI profilers that join me on the show, and we discuss solved and unsolved cases. We are starting to get into more unsolved cases, and our show is really, it's really like as close as you can get to being in the room with the FBI's BAU. That's our motto. So, if it's a solved case, we'll talk about the facts of the case. We'll talk about victimology, and we'll go through what our analysis was, and where we were right, where we were wrong. And then in some of the unsolved cases, now we get the facts of the case by talking to people, and then we do an analysis, and it really is very much like we're just sitting in a room talking about a case and talking about the behavior. And we really are just focused on the behavioral perspective of the case and the behavior that's exhibited before, during, and after the commission of a crime. And we've done a lot of interesting cases. We have probably about 25 shows out now, and it's I really enjoy it. I find it very rewarding.
Well, that's great. And just for our listeners, I'll make a plug for Julia. So I worked with Julia. She's an incredible agent. And I've also seen her in-person presentation about profiling. I just it was fascinating. And for those of you who do not have the opportunity to see Julia in person, I would recommend her podcast, The Consult. So that's it for today on the Law of the Case podcast. We'll see you next time. And I'm Alex Grant with special guest Julia Cowley. Okay, so that's it.